Hello everyone, and welcome to an introduction to formal logic. Now, in a very broad sense, what I want to do in this first module of the course is essentially the following. First, I want to articulate clearly and precisely the core idea of what it is we'll be studying in this class over the entire quarter. Next, I want to look at and clarify a number of basic but foundational concepts that inform the whole of logic as a field of study. Finally, I want to define a number of important technical terms that we'll be using in the study of logic over this quarter. That is, we will be looking at a kind of technical language that is traditionally used when you talk about logical topics. So a rather obvious starting point for the class is to ask simply the question, what is logic in the first place? And to offer a very simplistic, non-technical, and rather pared down definition, logic is just the study of arguments, of the methods and principles we use to distinguish correct from incorrect reasoning. Now, one of the things that makes this class kind of interesting or a little strange is that we're going to spend an entire quarter studying arguments, but we're not going to spend any time at all actually arguing anything. Rather, our goal here is to understand the fundamental nature of an argument, to understand what an argument is, what they're trying to do, what kinds of arguments exist, and ultimately, our real goal is to understand what makes an argument a good argument and what makes an argument a bad one. So before I set into the actual material of the course in this video, I want to take a moment to talk about how the class is structured, and in particular, how it's structured in relation to the videos that I'm going to be posting. Basically, we're going to be following the textbook you have very, very closely. And you'll be assigned in every module a certain number of sections from the book. What I plan to do is create for every section or group of sections a video that will cover very explicitly the material from that part of the textbook. So it should walk you through it, clarify ideas, and give you some help with what you're reading. So hopefully that will make sense to you as we go through the quarter. If not, feel free to contact me and we can discuss it. So let's start at the top. The first question we have to deal with is, what exactly is an argument in the first place? Since logic is a study of arguments, we need to figure out precisely what it is we're going to be studying. To take a definition straight from the textbook, an argument, as it occurs in logic, is a group of statements, one or more of which, the premises, are claimed to provide support for or reasons to believe one of the others, which is called the conclusion. Now, there are a number of very important things that we can glean from this particular definition. The first is that an argument is always and necessarily going to be comprised of multiple and different propositions. An argument can never be made or formed out of a single proposition alone. Now, it's worth noting that when we say proposition, we mean an individual isolated statement. A sentence can contain multiple propositions, so I could technically have an argument that is comprised of a single sentence, but it will always and necessarily have multiple and different propositions. The second thing to note about this is that for it to be an argument, it isn't enough that it just has multiple propositions. These multiple and different propositions must be in a distinct type of relationship to one another. And the relationship we're talking about is that of a premise to a conclusion relationship. And so the next step here is to try to define these very basic terms. So to reframe this more explicitly in the terms that we just saw in the definition of an argument, remember, must always have essentially and minimally two parts. The first of these is it must have a premise, right? The second is it must have a conclusion. So an argument is always and necessarily going to have these two pieces for it to be an argument at all. It must have a premise, at least one premise, and it's going to have a conclusion that follows from that premise. So what do these two things mean? What do we mean by a premise and what do we mean by a conclusion? Well, a conclusion in an argument is nothing more than the particular proposition or assertion being made in the argument that you're attempting to prove or defend. So in a nutshell, our conclusion is that claim that a person is trying to show you must be true or they're defending. The premise then is nothing more than the evidence given or the reason why you should accept that conclusion is true. Now that we have a working definition of our basic terms, of the idea of a premise and a conclusion, the next step here is to ask ourselves, how can we tell what is what in an actual argument? That is, how do we identify which pieces in an argument are actually the premises or the evidence given, and which piece or pieces are the conclusions that a person is trying to draw? Well, it turns out that there is no clear and easy way to sort this out. In the end, what you have to do is first isolate all the various propositions that are relevant to an argument and just sort them out so that you know what pieces exist in the argument at all. And then, frankly, you just have to ask, what is it that the speaker is trying to prove to me? And if you can determine and answer that question, you've identified your conclusion. And then finally, ask yourself, what possible evidence have they offered in defense of this particular claim, that is a conclusion? And if you can identify this or answer that question, you've started to identify what your premises are. So let's take a look at a very simple example of a very basic argument. And what we want to do then is basically tear it apart, look at the various pieces, and determine what constitutes a premise and what constitutes a conclusion. So the argument goes, almost every known human carcinogen causes cancer in animals, and so it is reasonable to expect that compounds that cause cancer in animals are also going to be potential human carcinogens. So you might take a second to pause the video and ask yourself, what is doing what? Which piece of this is going to be a premise, that is the evidence for some particular claim, and which piece of this is going to be the conclusion? Notice, in this particular argument, the premise is going to be almost every known human carcinogen causes cancer in animals. And what is this premise allegedly proving? Well, it's going to be trying to prove that we have good reason to think that if something causes cancer in an animal, then it's probably going to cause cancer in human beings. And again, if you think about this for a moment, it kind of makes sense. The conclusion is, if it causes cancer in animals, then it should cause cancer in human beings. And we know that because everything that we know causes cancer in a human being is going to cause cancer in animals. Let's take a look at another example. The pastoral letter fully deserves the wide audience it seeks. It is a thoughtful and comprehensive effort to bring religious and moral principles to bear on nuclear weapons. Now again, you might take a second to pause the video and think this through. What is this person trying to prove to you? In other words, what is your conclusion? And what is it that this person has offered as evidence in defense of that claim? So rather clearly, the evidence given here is that this is a thoughtful and comprehensive effort to bring religious and moral principles to bear on nuclear weapons. And what that allegedly shows us as a conclusion is that this letter deserves a wide audience. Now, one thing to note about this example in comparison to the last one is a really basic and simple point. In the second example about the pastoral letter, what we found was that the conclusion was initially stated first, and then the evidence was given. In the first example, it went the other way around. And the sort of lesson you can take from this is pretty basic. You cannot determine what counts as your conclusion or what your premises are by where it sits in an argument. The conclusion can show up at the end, at the beginning, or anywhere in between, and the premises can be dispersed throughout an argument. So that is not an effective or useful tool for trying to sort out what is what in an argument. In the end, once again, the only functional tool, the ultimate tool you have is to simply ask what role is each statement playing in the argument. So let's look at one last example here of an argument, and then we can kind of sort this out as we go. So Iran's charge d'affaires in Beirut, Mehdi Amirraji, said if America enters the war, all hostages in Iran will be killed. Therefore, America will not do any such thing, especially now that the American elections are close and the death of the hostages will not be to President Carter's advantage. Now, once again, I'd suggest you take a moment to pause the video and just stop and think about this for a moment. What counts as a conclusion and what are your premises? So if we take a moment to run through this, it's pretty clear that what this person is arguing is that America will not do any such thing. And by any such thing in this case, it means go to war with Iran. Why should we think this is true? Answering that question is essentially looking for evidence, and that's where your premises will be found. Well, in this case, it turns out we have two different premises that are working together to support this conclusion. The first premise is that if we go to war, then all the hostages are going to die. And the second premise is essentially that if all the hostages die, Carter's not going to win re-election. And because of those two premises, it is argued, we have good reason to think that America is not going to go to war. Notice in this particular example that the first line there is simply introducing who gave us the argument. It's not actually part of the argument, and so for our purposes, we can just throw that out. The argument is everything in the quotation marks. Now, while in the end it's true that you can't really tell what a premise is or the conclusion is through any other means than just thinking about what role it plays in the argument, by asking yourself basically, what is the evidence for this argument or for the conclusion, and what is the conclusion the person is trying to defend. But it turns out that in ordinary language and in really technical language, there are a whole host of indicator words, the job of which is to tell you what role each thing is playing. Now, let me give you some warning about this. Indicator words are, first of all, incredibly useful. They're something to pay very, very close attention to. When you see them, they should throw up red flags, and you should start looking for either premises or conclusions. But you should also be very careful with these because they are not a guarantee of anything. You can have indicator words in an argument or really a non-argument that are not actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. So this is really just a way of getting you to pay attention, but it's not a guarantee of anything. So what are our indicator words? Let's start with conclusion indicators. There are a whole host of these out there, and this is in fact a very, very short list of it. Things like therefore, so, thus, hence, accordingly. All of these kind of things essentially are telling you this is what my conclusion is. And so when you see something like therefore, you should pay very close attention to it because there's a very good chance that what follows this is going to be the conclusion. Now again, let me caution you, it is not a guarantee by any stretch. In the end, you still have to ask yourself, is this what this person is trying to prove to me? But it is a very good chance if you happen to see some of these indicator words. So let us take a look at a quick example. Going back to an argument that we've already seen, if you pay close attention to this, there's a very, very clear indication of a conclusion in this argument. The word so here is functioning as a kind of therefore. And if you think about what therefore means, it is quite literally just telling you, this is my conclusion. And notice what follows so in this particular argument is in fact the conclusion that this argument is trying to defend. Here's another example. Since the number of strategic warheads on each side far exceeds the number of significant non-military targets, we may reasonably infer that the majority of weapons must be aimed at military targets if they're aimed at anything at all. Now notice, in this argument, there's a very clear indication of conclusion. We may reasonably infer, which is just another way of saying therefore, right? And therefore is really your classic indication of a conclusion. And of course, if you pay attention to this, what follows, we may reasonably infer, is in fact the conclusion that's being defended. So there are also a whole host of other words that we use to indicate the premise. Because, since, for, as, which follows from, and the list goes on and on. All of these function to essentially try to tell you this is my evidence, right? Because this is true, therefore your conclusion is true. So let's take a look at another example. Given that my client was defending herself against an attack, she is innocent of the charges of murder. Now, if you pay close attention to this, the given that in this particular argument is essentially indicating premises. This is the evidence for the claim this person is innocent of the charges of murders. Basically, this is telling you because it was self-defense, therefore this person must be innocent. So let's take a look at another example. Aristotle argues, since then to fight against neighbors is an evil, and to fight against the Thebans is to fight against neighbors, it is clear that to fight against the Thebans is an evil. Now, if you pay close attention to this, every piece of this is, in some sense or another, labeled for you in terms of premises and conclusions by these various indicator words. Notice that the opening term, since, is really just a way of saying because to fight against neighbors is evil, and that indicates the premise. And notice the and in the second claim is also really connecting itself to that premise. And then finally, at the end, notice he's been kind enough to label also what the conclusion is. It is clear that because to fight against neighbors is an evil, and because to fight against Thebians is to fight against neighbors, therefore to fight against the Thebians is an evil. Again, every piece of this is basically indicated for you, labeled for you in terms of what the various rules are for each piece of this particular puzzle. Now let's take one last example before moving on here. Notice in this particular statement it says, since I arrived in Phoenix, I haven't had a moment's peace. Now this example is here for a reason, and the reason is quite simple. It's very tempting to look at this and think that I must have a nice, clear, clean premise indicator. Notice that since is one of our classics, but in this particular case, it is not indicating a premise. Rather, in this case, it's indicating a temporal reference. It's not saying because I arrived in Phoenix, therefore I haven't had a moment's peace. Rather, it's saying from this point forward. Now, it's worth paying attention to this to reiterate a point I've made more than once already in this section. The simple fact is, just because you see indicator words, whether it's for a premise or a conclusion, that by itself is not sufficient for you to say that you actually have a premise or a conclusion or an argument at all. In this particular case, we're not arguing anything. This is simply a statement. So one last point that needs to be covered before we move into different material is to talk about assumed or unstated propositions in an argument. What you will find is that in many, many cases, an argument will be developed or formed without everything being clearly stated in the argument. In other words, the person will simply assume that you already get that and it doesn't need to be stated for you. What we will see as we go through this quarter is that it is going to be very important for you to stop and dig out anything that is being assumed or any unstated propositions, and then you will have to state them formally and clearly in order to address and deal with the argument. This will be a very important point. It's going to be increasingly important as we wade through the quarter. So let's take a look at an example of this where we have something unstated, and it's very important that in order to deal with this argument properly, we have to dig out and state what it is that's missing. So the argument says John would have to be a fool to cheat on this test, and John is no fool. The first premise of this argument rather clearly is going to be that John would have to be a fool to cheat on this test. The second premise is going to be simply that John's not a fool. And the question that's left to us here is what follows from these two claims? Notice in the original argument, no conclusion was actually stated, but it's very clear that one is being implied here. And what is that conclusion? Well, the unstated conclusion is basically John's not going to cheat. If you think about this argument, it says John would have to be a fool to cheat, and he's not a fool, therefore John's not going to cheat. Now, it's very important as we wade through the quarter that when you have arguments like this where something is left unstated, that you can very clearly dig that out, state it clearly and in formal ways. So let's take a look at another example, and in this case one where a premise has been left unstated and we'll have to dig it out to make sense of the argument. So the argument goes, a dog was kept in the stalls, and yet though someone had been in and fetched out a horse, the dog had not barked. Obviously, the visitor was someone the dog knew well. Now, if you take a moment to think through this, the structure of this argument is pretty clear. It's pretty obvious which is going to be the conclusion and which is going to be a premise. So the premise that's given to us says the dog didn't bark at the person who went in the barn and took the horse. So the conclusion of the argument is pretty obvious as well. The dog knew the visitor well. Now these two pieces here, the conclusion and the premise, rather clearly imply one another. The premise says the dog didn't bark at this person, and the conclusion is the dog must have known the visitor. But of course, there's an unstated premise here that is absolutely necessary to move us from that first premise to the conclusion. And that unstated premise is simply that dogs typically bark at strangers. Now, this is an obvious point, and it's so obvious that it wasn't necessary to state it explicitly, but you really can't move from the first premise to the conclusion without that presumption sitting there formally. Right? The argument then is very simple. It says the dog didn't bark at the person, dogs typically bark at strangers, and therefore this person was not a stranger. That's what the argument is trying to say. And again, without this unstated second premise, the argument really doesn't make sense. So to move on, the next section of this video is going to address the distinction between arguments and non-arguments. Now you might wonder why we care about a non-argument since the class is really just the study of arguments. But it becomes a very, very important tool for us to recognize when we're arguing and when we're not, if for no other reason than if you can clearly identify when something is not functioning as an argument, then it shows you have a very good understanding of what an argument precisely is. So if you think about it, to go back to earlier parts of this video, an argument requires necessarily two things for it to be an argument at all. The first thing is that you need at least one proposition that claims to present evidence for or reasons to accept the truth of another. In other words, you need a premise, and if you don't have a premise, you can't have an argument. The second thing an argument requires is that there is at least one proposition that is somehow claimed to rationally follow from the evidence that was presented or given. And of course, what we're talking about here is simply a conclusion. So in the simplest sense, in order to have an argument, you must have at least one premise and then a completely different proposition or statement that allegedly follows from it as a conclusion. So an argument necessarily has these two pieces, a premise and a conclusion. And as we start wading through various types of non-arguments, it's worth keeping this in mind, because what you will see is that in every case where it's not arguing, one or both of these things are essentially missing. Right? You don't have the relationship of evidence to conclusion being given to you in these various statements. So the way we're going to approach this, following the book, is essentially to wade through different non-argumentative categories. And the goal here is to define these things, to understand what they are, and in particular, why they are not arguments. So here's a short list. We have non-inferential passages, expository passages, illustrations, explanations, and conditional statements. And for our purposes, the bottom two are going to be very important for us, and we'll spend a little extra time on each of those. So let's start with a non-inferential passage. A non-inferential passage is a passage in which there is no intention to assert that a premise is being offered to support some particular conclusion. So it turns out there's a whole host of subcategories of non-inferential passages: a warning, piece of advice, a statement of belief, a report, or what are called loosely associated statements. The thing to keep in mind with every last one of these is that in the end, what they share in common is none of them are attempting to draw any conclusions. To put this in very simple terms, all of these are merely asserting something is the case. They're not trying to prove it to you, they just say it is so. So let's look at a warning. Right? A warning is simply a form of expression that is only intended to put someone on guard against a situation. It, of course, is not going to give you any reason why you should do that necessarily, but it is telling you that it's something you should do. So think about this goofy example. It says, never trust anyone who doesn't drink coffee. Now notice in this case, it is an assertion. It's saying you shouldn't do this, but it doesn't give you any reason why you should do this, and it's not drawing any conclusion from this. If it were, say, never trust anyone who doesn't drink coffee, and then point to Bob and say Bob doesn't drink coffee, therefore you shouldn't trust him, now you have an argument. But by itself, this claim alone, don't trust people who don't drink coffee, merely asserts something without any evidence and without an attempt to become an argument. A piece of advice is pretty much the same thing, to be perfectly honest. It's a form of expression that is only intended to make a recommendation to somebody about a future course of action. And again, notice the important thing here is that there's no reason given for that claim. It just says this is something you should do or you should consider doing. So an example of this would be something like, the best way to find out if you can trust somebody is to trust them. Notice by itself, this claim alone merely says this is a good way to do something. It doesn't offer any evidence to justify this claim, and there is no conclusion that's actually drawn from it. A statement of belief, as another type of non-inferential passage, is a form of expression that communicates only what a person feels or believes about something. Now, these are interesting ones because quite often what we feel or believe is exactly the kind of thing that's going to lead us into an argument, where someone will demand we justify our beliefs and we have to offer some sort of evidence. But the point here is really simple. Your belief about something by itself or how you feel about something by itself is not an argument. It only becomes an argument if you attempt to offer proof or evidence for your claims. So an example of this would be something like, the songs written by the Beatles in their formative years were better than those they wrote towards the end of their career. Now notice this claim by itself merely asserts that's what I think about the Beatles and their music career. But of course, it's not hard to see how something like this could lead to an argument. It wouldn't be hard to imagine someone saying, nonsense, what about Abbey Road, or whatever. But of course, notice in this particular case, if we just stop here and look simply at this proposition, there is no evidence offered in defense of it. They haven't shown you that certain songs or albums were better. They haven't done anything to prove this claim. And there's nothing that follows from this that has been defended. So it's not a premise. It's not a conclusion. This is merely a statement of someone's own personal beliefs. A report, very much like a statement of belief, is really just a statement of fact. Right? It's a form of expression that merely conveys information about some topic or event. All it does is say, this is true, and that's it. So an example would be something like, the Beatles regularly performed at different clubs in Hamburg during the period from August 1960 to December 1962. Now notice, this is merely a statement of fact. This is what happened. It might be true, it might be false, but no evidence has been given to prove this claim is true, and nothing has been argued with this as evidence. We didn't say, therefore, something follows. So notice, if we don't have that premise-conclusion relationship, then we don't have an argument. Merely asserting something as a fact is not enough to actually have an argument. Something has to follow from that. Let's take another example of a report or a statement of fact. A human being's facial profile is vertical, and its most prominent feature is the nose. Now notice in this particular example, what we have is simply an assertion about how human faces are, what they're like. But what we don't have is any evidence that's been given to justify this claim. So notice it's not functioning as some conclusion of an argument. And it's not being used to prove something else, like Bob must be human because his face is vertical. This by itself, this claim by itself, is merely an assertion of how human beings' faces are. And until it's used in conjunction with another statement to either prove something or as evidence to prove something else, then we can't really talk about it as an argument. It's worth noting in this particular example that if you stop in your own mind and think about human faces that you've seen, like let's say your friends, your siblings, or your parents or something, and you say, oh yeah, that's true. They must be vertical. That face was, that face was, and so on. Notice what you've done already in your own mind is constructed an argument. Now you have examples of human faces that you're using to draw the conclusion that this statement is true. But again, by itself, this claim is simply a statement of fact. It is not an argument, and it shouldn't be construed as one. The last of our non-inferential passages that we need to consider is what is called loosely associated statements. You can think of these as essentially just a bunch of assertions without any evidence offered in defense of them, so that they're not really working together to prove anything. They're merely a collection of statements about a similar topic where none of them intend to offer evidence for any of the others. To offer a very extreme and easy example of this point, water is wet, swimming pools are filled with water, many colleges and universities have collegiate water sports. Water is fun to play in. Notice what we have here are just a handful of assertions about water. None of these function as evidence for any of the others. Nobody's trying to prove anything. We're just making a number of assertions or claims about water. So they're loosely associated in that sense, but they're just a bunch of statements. Never are we offered any proof, and so we can't look at this as an argument. So let's move on from all the various non-inferential passages to a different category of non-arguments, the expository passage. An expository passage is essentially one where we have a topic sentence that's given, and then the speaker merely expounds upon the topic without the intention of proving that that original sentence is true. So in short, we assert something, give you a claim, and then what we do is elaborate and offer more detail without trying to prove that it's true. So here's a very easy example. It says there are only 4 traditional ingredients in beer: water, malted grains, hops, and yeast. Now notice that's our original topic statement. Everything that follows after this is not an attempt to prove that that's true. Rather, what it does is elaborate on that point. So we say the water provides a substrate for the beer, the malted grains provides readily fermentable sugars, the hops provide both flavor and preserving qualities, and the yeast breaks down the sugars in the malt through fermentation into both alcohol and carbon dioxide. Now, one way to think about this and to understand why this is not an argument is to just stop and ask yourself, in that first claim that there are only 4 traditional ingredients in beer, if you didn't believe that to be true, right? If you were absolutely convinced that traditionally there were 10 ingredients in beer, would anything that follows that initial sentence offer you evidence to justify the claim that there are only 4 traditional ingredients in beer? The fact that water provides a substrate for beer explains what water's doing there, but it doesn't prove to you that there are only 4 traditional ingredients in beer. And this is a useful sort of tool to tell if you're arguing or not. Just ask yourself, if I don't believe that's true, have I been given any evidence? In this case, clearly not. So to move on to the next category of non-arguments, an illustration. An illustration is essentially a passage where a statement is made about a topic, and then specific instances or examples are used, but only to illustrate the point. So what we do is we turn to examples not to prove something to you, but to basically show you what I mean by something. So a very nice and easy example of this. Chemical elements as well as compounds can be represented by molecular formulas. Thus, oxygen is represented by O2, water by H2O, and sodium chloride by NaCl. Now notice in this particular case, the original statement, chemical elements can be represented by molecular formulas. Everything that follows there is an example of a chemical element being represented by a formula, but it's not there to prove it to you. It just wants to show you what they mean by that. As a quick aside, notice that this particular example about chemical elements is clearly not an argument, but it does have in it a very classic conclusion indicator, thus, therefore. And if you pay close attention to this, it's pretty obvious that this indicator word is not indicating a conclusion. So again, the point here, to go back to something earlier in this video, we need to be very careful with those indicator words. Just because you see one like thus or therefore or because, that by itself is not a reason to think that what follows has to be a premise or a conclusion. And in fact, it's not even a reason to think that it's an argument at all. So the next one we have to look at is an explanation. And we're going to spend a little extra time with this, and I want to move somewhat outside of the scope of the book to do so. This, I think, is going to present us with one of the more important and useful non-argument categories in argumentation and logic. So an explanation is essentially a passage or a group of propositions which intend only to shed light on some known event or on an already accepted phenomenon. Now, there are a couple things that are worth paying very close attention to in this definition, and let's try to dig those out. The first of these comes at the end, right? Essentially, in an explanation, the proposition being explained is already assumed by everyone involved to be true. There is no need for anyone to present any evidence because nobody's complaining about it and no one's in doubt of the claim. So the second important idea we can get from this definition is that an explanation is always going to be a group of propositions. That means that an explanation must have always more than one distinct proposition for it to be an explanation at all. And in this sense, it has something kind of in common with an argument, something that makes it actually pretty easy to confuse the two. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you take a look at an argument and you think back to what we've already talked about in the class, an argument requires, no matter what, at least 2 things. You have to have a premise and a conclusion that follows from that premise. So I need at least two distinct and different claims in the argument, and there has to be a very distinct kind of relationship between them, a premise to conclusion relationship. Well, it turns out that an explanation has a very, very similar structure, but with a very different goal. In order to have an explanation, I must have at least two different propositions, what we call an explain-ands and an explain-andum. Now, the explain-ands is essentially the thing in an explanation that's doing the explaining for us, and the explain-andum is the thing that's being explained. And notice there is a distinct relationship that has to be there between these two different propositions for it to be an explanation. But the relationship is not that of a premise to a conclusion. So how exactly are arguments different from explanations? We can understand the distinction between explanations and arguments largely in terms of asking a different kind of why question. An argument essentially is asking, how do you know that that's true? And essentially, we demand an argument of someone when we do not yet accept a proposition as true, and we're looking for some rational basis for doing so. An explanation, on the other hand, is asking, why is that so? And notice, when we ask a question like, why is that so, there's a presumption that we already accept it as true. We request an explanation of someone when we already accept a proposition as true, but we're trying to understand why it is the way it is. So you can make this distinction intuitive by observing that for pretty much any statement we make, we can adopt towards it either an argumentative stance, where we demand to know, how do you know that that's true? Or we can adopt an explanatory stance, where we accept it as true, but instead we want to know, how did it come to be that way? So let's take an example of this point. Take the claim, my cell phone is broken. Now, it turns out towards this claim, this simple proposition or assertion, my cell phone is broken, I can adopt either an argumentative stance, at which point I'm going to say, how do you know it's broken? Or I could adopt an explanatory stance, and then I just want to know what happened. So if we take an argumentative stance towards the claim, my cell phone is broken, I'm going to ask of you, how do you know that's true? And notice essentially what I'm saying is, I'm not sure I believe it's broken. Right? I want proof that it's broken. Prove it to me that it actually doesn't work. And something like it won't power up, and I could show you or whatever, is going to be evidence that would in fact show that the phone is broken and not working. If, on the other hand, I adopt an explanatory stance, then I'm going to ask you, what happened? How did your phone come to be broken? And again, notice at this point, I believe you. You don't have to prove it to me. I accept the fact that your phone is broken, but I want to know what happened to get it into that state. And so something like, I dropped it in the toilet, would be a functional explanation of what made your cell phone be broken. So a really important idea here, one that's worth thinking a good deal about, is the fact that the explanatory responses and the argumentative responses don't really work together. One doesn't do the same job as the other. So let's say you claim that your cell phone is broken, and I ask you, why is that so? Notice if your answer to that is, well, it won't power up, that doesn't actually answer my question. It doesn't explain to me what happened so that your phone was broken. It would prove that your phone doesn't work, but it doesn't show me why it's broken. And notice the other way around. If I don't believe that your cell phone is broken, and I ask you, how do you know that it's broken? You merely telling me that you dropped it or you dropped it in the toilet is not itself sufficient reason to think that it's actually broken. It might still work. Merely because you dropped it isn't proof that it isn't working. I would want to see something else as evidence. So it's really important to understand the distinction between an argument and an explanation can be very beautifully and powerfully sorted out by just thinking, what kind of question are you asking? Are you looking for proof? Do you not believe the claim? Are you, in other words, asking, how do you know that that's true? If that's what's happening, then you're dealing with an argument. If, on the other hand, someone is simply asking, why is it so? In other words, they believe the proposition, but they don't understand how it came to be that way, then you're not arguing anymore. What that person is looking for or demanding from you is an explanation. This is a really powerful tool, something to pay close attention to, and I would actually suggest to take a moment or two to think about other examples of propositions and just adopt various stances to them and try to figure out why one doesn't work to answer the other question. Now, there's another way to think about the difference here, although this is less concrete and not as useful a tool, but it is something that is, as a general rule, pretty useful for sorting out the distinction between an argument and a non-argument. It turns out that in an argument, what we find is that the premise-conclusion relationship is going to be one that moves from a claim that we accept as true to one that is less known or accepted. So essentially, a premise moves from an accepted fact. We assert something as evidence that people agree with, and then we use that to prove something that people don't agree with. In an explanation, everything goes the other way around. The thing at the top is the thing that is less known, and the thing at the bottom, the explainandum, or the thing we're trying to explain, is something that is quite known and we accept. No one is looking for proof. So what happens here is we move from what is known as an accepted fact here, and then we turn to what is less clear and less known as a way of trying to make sense of it. So let's look at an example or two of this. Here's an explanation. It says cows can digest grass and humans cannot because their digestive systems contain enzymes not found in human beings. Now notice in this particular case, it's pretty clear that there's not much room for dispute or confusion about the explanandum. Cows can digest grass and humans cannot is an obvious fact that I'm guessing everybody in this class and everybody you know is well aware of. We know we can't eat grass and we know that cows do. So there's no need for proof on this point. Nobody's debating this. But we might want to know why it is that way, and then we turn to something that is more complex and less obvious, which is biology, to try to explain it. And again, if you stop and think about this, if we take the claim cows can digest grass and humans cannot as our proposition, if we wanted to argue the point, if in other words we said, how do you know that's true? Merely pointing out that we have different enzymes in our stomachs is not going to prove it to you. What you would want is something very different, like a study that's done, or you might actually just do one yourself and go try to eat a bunch of grass or something like this. But it's important to recognize that the evidence or the explainands here that's given is not really functioning as a premise. It doesn't do that work because it's not answering that specific question. How do you know it's true? So let's turn to the last of our non-argumentative categories. This is what we call a conditional statement. So a single conditional statement by itself only asserts that a conditional relationship exists between two different terms. While these can often be parts of arguments, and in particular, a good many of deductive arguments that we'll be looking at in this class, by itself, a conditional statement cannot be an argument because it doesn't attempt to prove anything at all. So what exactly is a conditional statement? A conditional statement, in a nutshell, is just an if-then kind of claim. So as an example, if you want to know what a man's like, take a good look at how he treats his inferiors, not his equals. Notice that this statement by itself merely asserts, it doesn't try to argue anything, it asserts that if under the conditions that you want to know what a man is like, then you should do this. It offers no evidence for this claim as to why you should do it, and it's not drawing any conclusions from it. But again, in a nutshell, a conditional statement is just any if-then sort of claim. So let's look at one last example of a conditional statement. In this particular case from Montesquieu, he says, if triangles had a god, they would give him 3 sides. Now notice again, what we have here is not an argument about anything by itself, though it would not be hard to turn it into one. What we have basically is an assertion that under the conditions that triangles had a god, what follows is they would give him 3 sides. It doesn't say this is what happens, it says only if, under those conditions, it would have to be that way. So the last point we have to cover in this video is dealing with what is called an argument reconstruction. This is unfortunately something that we don't have a lot of time to go through, but it's very important, and for the most part the way we'll deal with this is I will introduce it now, and then it's pretty much just trial by fire as we go through the quarter. Argument reconstruction is very important. It's an incredibly useful and powerful tool, and it's necessary for everything that we do in this class. We don't have a lot of time to practice this, but again, as I said, what we'll do is basically work through this basic idea now as an initial introduction, and then we'll just keep doing it over and over again as we go through the quarter. What we find as we start wading through arguments is that when we encounter an argument in an ordinary context, in a book or in a discussion or the like, what we discover is that they're rarely presented in a clear, organized, premise-conclusion form that we can work with. So what reconstruction does for us is simply take an argument that is messy and disorderly, and it tries to state them in a clear, orderly way. So the objective here is to clearly, concisely restate the argument that you're evaluating, and restate it in such a way that, first of all, it is simplified and reduced to the core fundamental claims of the argument, and second, that you retain the arguer's original purpose, reasoning, and meaning. You do not want to distort or misrepresent what is being said. So, some basic considerations when you work through argument reconstruction. So the first and really the most important point of argument reconstruction is that you do everything in your power to retain the original meaning of the argument. Be charitable even when you do this. Do not try to misrepresent an argument. Take the strongest version of it that you can find, the one that is most reasonable, and work with this. To understand what we're aiming at here, it's useful to turn to Daniel Dennett, a very famous contemporary philosopher, and some advice he gives on successful critical commentary or reconstruction of arguments. The point he's going to use here is this. He says you should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, so vividly and fairly that your target says, "Thanks, I wish I'd thought of putting it that way." The reason for this is really simple. If you can refute or address the argument in its strongest possible form, then you're actually in a pretty powerful spot in terms of your critical commentary. If, on the other hand, the best you can do is try to refute something that the arguer himself didn't actually say or mean and so on, then really all you're doing is strawmanning the person, and you haven't really made any serious ground. The next consideration is that what you want to do is express each relevant proposition as a complete sentence. So we're literally in an argument reconstruction just listing propositions, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, and so on, and each one of these should be expressed as a complete or total sentence. And then basically you want to work to identify any implicit premises that the author clearly employed or they expected us to understand as part of the argument, but didn't write out or state explicitly. In other words, stop and think about it. Are there any possible unstated premises or an unstated conclusion that needs to be expressed in order to understand this argument? And then finally, we're going to list this. And quite literally, you just list it, premise 1, premise 2, and so on, in order with the conclusion at the end. And these are typically separated by a line. So we have our list of premises, and then you draw a line, and then you put your conclusion underneath it. So these are the basic considerations that you have when you're reconstructing an argument. Keep these in mind as we go through this, and what we'll do now for the rest of this video is walk through a handful of examples. So let's take this example. Cable television can provide the viewer with more channels than broadcast television, and it usually delivers a higher quality picture. For these reasons, the number of cable subscribers will probably continue to grow rapidly. Now, the first thing you should do when you're trying to reconstruct is go look for indicator words, conclusion or premises. Pay attention to these things. Again, they're not a guarantee of anything, but they're incredibly useful. And in many, many cases, what you will find is they will just lay out the structure of an argument for you in very clear terms. In this particular case, it's very clear what our conclusion is going to be, and because we have a nice conclusion indicator for these reasons. So our conclusion, of course, is what comes after this. Right? The conclusion, and what we want to do is write it off to the side, put conclusion or C by it. The number of cable subscribers will probably continue to grow rapidly. This is what the person is trying to prove to you. This is the conclusion of the argument. Then we want to draw a line between that, and then we just list our various premises. In this case, we have two different premises, and they really can be expressed almost exactly in the same terms that they're given. Notice in the second premise, we want to express this as a complete sentence. In the original, it says it usually delivers a higher quality picture. We want to express it as a complete statement or thought to itself, which is cable television has a higher quality picture than broadcast television. This captures the full sentiment of that premise. And what we have here when we're finished is a complete reconstruction of a fairly simple argument. Two premises, one conclusion, listed in order as complete sentences with conclusion and a line that separates them. So let's take another example, one that we've seen before. So Iran's charge d'affaires said, if America enters the war, all hostages in Iran will be killed. Therefore, America will not do any such thing, especially now that the elections are close and the death of the hostages will not be to President Carter's advantage. So the first step here is to go check for indicator words. And we have a very clear indication of conclusion, therefore, which is really the classic conclusion indicator. And of course, what follows this is going to be our conclusion. Now notice the conclusion as expressed in the original argument is simply America will not do any such thing. But this is pretty ambiguous and unclear, and so we want to try to re-express this in clear, concise terms as a complete sentence. A better reconstruction then would be America will not go to war with Iran. Well, why not? What are our premises? And it turns out we have two, and we've seen these before. The first premise says, if America enters the war, then all hostages in Iran will be killed. The second premise says, essentially, if the hostages are killed, then Carter will not win re-election. Now, it's worth taking a moment here to think about this, because these two premises by themselves presume another premise that actually gets us to the conclusion at the end, which is America's not going to go to war with Iran. And that would be an unstated claim that Carter's going to do what he needs to do to win the election. Without that third premise, it doesn't necessarily follow that the conclusion would have to be true. With it, it makes perfect sense. So if America goes to war, hostages die. If the hostages die, Carter's not going to win re-election. Carter wants to win re-election, therefore we don't go to war. That's a clear, concise, and very useful reconstruction of the argument. And again, notice what we have, three premises listed in order with a conclusion at the end and a line to separate the two. Notice too that all the stuff in the beginning is not actually part of the argument at all. It is not a premise and it's not a conclusion, and so we can just throw it out. It is fluff, it's useless stuff. Cross it out, don't use it. All it does in this case is tell us who said it, and that's not really relevant to whether or not this is a serious argument. It's not actually part of the argument at all. So when you come across stuff that's not part of the argument, just cross it out and work with only things that matter, that are actual premises for the argument or the conclusion. Let's take another example. This is from Alan Turing. He argued, although he argues against this ultimately, but thinking is a function of a man's immortal soul. God has given an immortal soul to every man and woman, but not to any other animals or to machines. Hence, no animal or machine can think. Now, the first step here, again, is to go sort out any indicator words. Go look for those. Again, it's not a guarantee of anything, but they are useful tools. They're worth paying very close attention to. And in this particular case, hence is a very clear conclusion indicator. It just means, therefore, this is my conclusion. And so we know what our conclusion will be. The conclusion is essentially animals and machines cannot think. We'll see later on in the course that we would probably want to express this in slightly different terms in order to state it formally in terms of a categorical syllogism, but we'll deal with that stuff later. So our conclusion is animals and machines cannot think. Why not? What are our premises? Answering that question is going to give us essentially two claims. The capacity for thinking is a function of a soul, or to put it in slightly different terms, you have to have a soul in order to think. And the second premise says animals and machines do not have souls. Right? Now what we have here is a very clear, very basic reconstruction where every statement is given as a complete, clear sentence. It captures the original meaning of the argument, and it gives us in a clear reconstructed form with premises listed, a conclusion at the end, and a line separating them. Another example. This is from Leibniz. He says, since happiness consists in peace of mind, and since durable peace of mind depends on the confidence we have in the future, And since that confidence is based on the science we should have of the nature of God and the soul, it follows that science is necessary for true happiness. Now, if we start wading through this, again, the first step is to just go look for indicator words. And in this case, Leibniz is incredibly generous. He, in fact, labels every last bit of this argument. Since, it follows that. We have premise, 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 conclusion. This is basically just given to you in utterly blatant terms. So let's start at the bottom. Our conclusion is science is necessary for true happiness. But if you really think about this, and if you know anything about Leibniz and the time he's writing, when he says science, he means, we can go just a step up to this, science that we should have of the nature of God and the soul. And of course, when we talk about the science of the nature of God and the soul, what we're talking about is essentially metaphysics or philosophy. So his real point is that philosophy is necessary for true happiness, which is a really valuable thing, and one more reason why you should consider being a philosophy major. The rest of this is frankly just listed for you, and if you pay close attention to this, this is really, really structured. It says happiness consists of peace of mind, confidence in future, philosophy. Therefore, happiness, philosophy. An incredibly structured, very well organized basic argument. So let's take a look at an example that's a bit more challenging. This is from author Schopenhauer. He writes, if the criminal law forbids suicide, that is not an argument valid in the church. And besides, the prohibition is ridiculous, for what penalty can frighten a person who's not afraid of death? Now, this particular example is far more challenging because a lot of it really is not relevant to the argument in a certain sense. That is, it's not part of the argument itself, but a whole bunch of this is simply providing what is necessary to understand the actual argument. So let's begin where we began with all the others. Let's go look for indicator words. The most obvious one we have here is going to be for or because. This is essentially telling us we have a premise, and the premise then would be what penalty can frighten a person who's not afraid of death itself. So let's stop for a moment and think about the conclusion. The conclusion is actually pretty obvious. It says, besides, the prohibition is ridiculous. So our conclusion is basically the prohibition is ridiculous. But to understand what that means, we have to go to all the stuff above that. What kind of prohibition are we talking about? Well, it is basically a criminal prohibition of suicide. That's what he's complaining about. Notice all the stuff about the church is not actually relevant to this argument in the sense of being a premise or a conclusion, but it gives us all the information necessary to understand what prohibition he's talking about. So his conclusion can be stated as a criminal or legal prohibition of suicide is ridiculous. So we have a very obvious premise here, and it's the one that follows the premise indicator. In the original, it's framed as a kind of question that says, what penalty can frighten a person who is not afraid of death itself? Now, if we want to express the core sentiment of this premise, he is essentially saying there is no legal penalty that can frighten a person who is not afraid of dying. Now, of course, if you stop and think about this, this is the evidence given for the claim that a legal prohibition on suicide is ridiculous. But by itself, that is not enough to make sense of this argument. What's missing? You might take a second to think about this, but there's a very important and very clear, once you figure it out, premise that is unstated and absolutely necessary to get us to this conclusion. So the unstated premise of this argument is that the very purpose of legal penalty is to deter unwanted behavior. If you think about it, we punish people with fines and other things precisely because we don't want them to do certain things. Right? We have speeding tickets, or we punish drunk driving and so on because we want to deter this unwanted behavior. Now notice, once you have this idea that the purpose of legal punishment is to deter things, the second premise now combines very nicely with that to get us to our conclusion. Because if the point of legal penalty is to deter behavior, and there is no possible penalty you could impose to deter this certain type of behavior, then there's no reason why you would have legal punishment. It doesn't make any sense. The very purpose of legal punishment has been basically defrayed by the inability to be frightened of the punishment. So let's take a look at another example, this one from John Stuart Mill in his rather exceptional essay on liberty. He writes, "The particular evil of silencing the expression of opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, then they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error." Now this one's incredibly wordy, and for the most part, to make sense of it, we can cross a lot of this stuff out. It's also worth noting that there are no indicator words to help us here. So we just have to stop and ask ourselves, what is he trying to prove here? And the conclusion rather clearly is that censorship robs the human race, both existing generations and future ones. Why should we think that this is true? Well, essentially what we find is that our premises are primarily constructed out of the two conditional statements, the if-then claims. Remember, a conditional statement by itself is not arguing anything, but they can be used to form all kinds of powerful arguments like this one. So notice there is an unstated premise that is incredibly important here, that is not so obvious at first glance, but to get there, we would have to have this. And that unstated premise is essentially whatever censored opinion we have must either be a true opinion or a false one. And once we have that, we basically have two different conditional statements that will resolve those two alternatives, it being true or being false. So either the censored opinion is true or it's false. If it's true, then we're robbed of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. And if it's false, we're robbed of a better understanding of truth. And notice what this leads to is censorship robs us no matter what. So again, what we have here is a very clear reconstruction of the argument. Three premises listed in order, conclusion at the bottom, and a line to separate them. So let's look at the last of these, and then we'll be done for this particular video. This is from Bertrand Russell. He argues, "The evils of the world are due to moral defects quite as much as to lack of intelligence. But the human race has not hitherto discovered any method of eradicating moral defects. Intelligence, on the contrary, is easily improved by methods known to every competent educator. Therefore, until some method of teaching virtue has been discovered, progress will have to be sought by improvement of intelligence rather than morals." Now, first of all, there's a very obvious conclusion indicator here, again worth paying very close attention to. Therefore, what follows is going to be our conclusion, and in fact, it is our conclusion. So what we find is progress, or moral progress, should be sought by improvement of intelligence rather than morals. The next question then is why? What reasons do we have for this? Well, essentially we have three premises, and they're all pretty much clearly given to us in a proper order to make sense of the argument. The first premise says the evils of the world are equally due to moral defects as to a lack of intelligence. The second premise says we can't improve moral defects. The third says we can improve intelligence, and therefore we should try to improve intelligence. That's basically its argument. Now again, in terms of reconstruction, some very basic points to keep in mind. The first is you want to reconstruct it by listing all of your premises in order, including unstated premises, and then the conclusion at the bottom with the line separating them. Every statement should be given as a complete statement or sentence, and do everything in your power to represent the argument fairly. So that's an end to this particular video. This is one of the longer ones for this particular module, and I apologize for that. You'll have two more to get us through this module that will represent or basically cover material in other sections of the chapter. If you have any questions about any of this stuff or any of the stuff in this module, or really anything about the class or the syllabus and so on, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to talk to you through email or through Zoom or whatever we can set up. And until then, I'll see you at the first Zoom meeting.